Good Friday afternoon, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com with our early look at action this weekend in college football. We got a lot of great top 25 games to break down. Before we do that, we'll take a look back at what we saw in Week 1. We'll talk about how Hurricane Irma's impacting a lot of games in Florida this weekend. And to do all of that, I need to bring in the host and founder of RobVenoSports.com, and none other than Rob Veno himself. Rob, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Rob. How about you?
Doing very well. We got a lot to talk about. We saw some good games last weekend. I mean, Alabama looked like Alabama, maybe not so much on the offensive side of the ball, but defensively they looked really good, but they lost a few key guys. So we'll begin there with the losses to Alabama and to Florida State as well.
Yeah, well, obviously you would figure the loss for Florida State is larger. That's not to downplay what Alabama loses on the perimeter as far as defense is concerned, but to lose DeAndre Francois this early in the season I think is tough for FSU. They're going to have to go at it. And, you know, the good news, Rob, is that this week they get a game where they're a 30-plus point favorite and they can try and get some things established, maybe shave down the playbook a little bit and see what works and what doesn't work and how much they can get incorporated into their game plan for the weeks ahead. But, you know, that's a big loss. That's a kid who, you know, a lot of people thought might be first-team All-ACC. Certainly he's known on the national level right now. Was playing, you know, fairly well against an Alabama defense that's difficult to crack until late fourth quarter when he went out. So I would say that it's tougher for Florida State, but they do get somewhat of a break in the fact that they have a cakewalk this week in their contest. But boy, oh boy, upcoming, it's just not going to be easy for them. We'll have to see how this all works out. But that's just a terrible blow for a team that really, really had expectations of being in the college football playoff this year. That's not to say that they can't be. But that's a pretty tough way to start. And they have Miami on deck on the 16th. So it's going to be a very, very quick learning process for Florida State as an offensive unit.
Well, Robin, let's talk about that just a little bit here. Florida State really caught a bad break with Hurricane Irma moving through Florida this weekend, canceling a lot of games. And we'll get to all the cancellations as we kind of go through it here. But you start with Florida State, Louisiana Monroe, originally scheduled for 7 o'clock Saturday night, moved up to noon before being canceled because the timing of the storm had moved up a little bit and some evacuation orders were issued. Huge disadvantage for Florida State as far as I'm concerned. They're now going to throw a true freshman into the fire for his first game against a top 10 program in Miami versus getting some reps and the jitters out against a little bit easier opponent in Louisiana Monroe.
Yeah, that's great, Rob. Scratch everything I just said because I'd forgotten that game was amongst the cancellations yesterday as well. So, yeah, all Florida schools are not on the board now. Everybody all postponed. So it does make it more difficult. I mean, to add on to what I was saying there, if they had had a game, it would have been nice to incorporate something, but it does make it so difficult now to jump into Miami and NC State after that. That's two very, very solid ACC defenses that they're going to go into almost blind, not knowing what they have. Now, you know, from our perspective, I guess it's blind. From Jimbo Fisher's perspective, he knows what he has on his quarterback depth chart. He knows the abilities of his QBs, and, you know, there can always be a performance put forth against Miami that comes unexpected in a positive way. However, 90% of the time that's not what happens. So it's going to be difficult. The off week, rather than having a game this week, the off week is going to be used to prepare. He'll prepare against the Florida State defense, which, you know, again, if you're searching for positives, practicing against the Seminoles defense is a good defense to practice against. It doesn't come any tougher. They did a great job against Alabama in the loss the other night. So that kind of helps out. But, again, I don't think we can emphasize enough how difficult a position it puts Florida State in now after, well, not even 4 quarters of football to lose their starting quarterback for the season, a guy that they were really counting on heavily to be the engineer of what, was expected to be a real good offensive season. I mean, with Dalvin Cook gone, Francois could have taken a lot of the load here in his sophomore year as far as the passing game is concerned to maybe help Cam Akers, freshman running back for Florida State. But now that's not going to happen. So it's kind of a wait-and-see approach. We'll read the reports as they come along as to how the progression is going, but I don't think we'll know until they hit the field. And like we've both said here, Miami of Florida is a real rugged test from the outset. That's a bitter rivalry to start with. That's a real good team down there under Mark Richt right now, especially on the defensive side. And to follow that with NC State, even though NC State lost in week 1, you go look at the box score, and NC State absolutely destroyed South Carolina inside the box score. South Carolina did not move the ball at all on that defense. So it's going to be tough for FSU.
Well, we talk about their first tough test against Miami. Miami also had a game this weekend against Arkansas State that was postponed because of the hurricane. And a little bit of flack, and I don't necessarily buy into this or understand it, but a little bit from some of the national media types, including Rick Neuheisel, that said Miami did not want to travel to Arkansas State and play a road game against them. There was nothing for them to gain by going to play this game, win, and it's what you were expected to do, lose, and it's disastrous to your playoff chances. And you saw Arkansas State give Nebraska all they could handle on Saturday night on what turned out to be a very good game. Do you buy into that at all? I don't. I really think it's a safety thing, and I think Miami would have won the game anyway. I understand the why take the risk part. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to make the case, well, I guess it would be a different case to make for South Florida, which was going to travel up to UConn and didn't know that they'd be able to get back to South Florida after the game. That's why that one was canceled. Certainly there's no weather concern up in Stores, but the concern for South Florida was getting back home. So they decided to stay put. I guess, I started to say that you could almost make the same case, the difference being South Florida UConn is a divisional conference game where Miami and Arkansas State is non-conference. However, I kind of agree with you. I think it's done solely for safety purposes and for the fact that a lot of these kids want to be with their families and whatnot at home rather than travel and not be able to get back home. So there's a lot of human concerns outside of football, which is where Coach Neuheisel was coming from. Arkansas State winged it around a lot against Nebraska. 64 times they threw the football, and they spread Nebraska out, and they almost got that game into overtime. I mean, it came down to a pass in the end zone that was just overthrown. Otherwise, we'd be looking at a 43-43 overtime game there. So it would have been a good test for Miami, and I'm sure that Mark Richt welcomes that type of spread offense, throw it around type of test. It gets them prepared for what they see in the ACC from quite a few teams nowadays. So I'm kind of with you, Rob. I don't buy into the fact that there's nothing to gain by playing that game, so why not just cancel it? I think certainly much more to the human side were the concerns of both Miami and South Florida. The South Florida game, I would be fairly sure that they would try and pick up later in the year because it is conference and division related. We remember the LSU Florida game last season, which wasn't going to be made up, and then it was in the end. There's always a chance to change and go ahead and play it if it's necessary. We'll see what the outcomes are, but
as of now, they're not planning to reschedule, which for UConn I don't think is a big deal. They're not going places this year anyway. I think for South Florida, the only thing that could hurt them is if, let's say, they finish 6-1 and a team ahead of them in the division finishes 7-1, and they would have had the tiebreaker if they were also 7-1. I think at that point it could become a bit of an issue, but otherwise I don't think you're going to see them make any efforts to reschedule that game. Interesting point on a few of the other teams from Florida this weekend that have road games. Florida Atlantic has a million reasons, literally, to find their way to Madison, Wisconsin this weekend. So they have been able to safely travel for their game, and Florida International has moved their game against Alcorn State to Birmingham tonight. I imagine the fans are lining up to get in to see that game this evening, and the reason for that is Florida International looking to get the 6 wins and get into a bowl game, and that's one of their very winnable games on the schedule. They needed to get it played.
Yeah, and I'm sure Butch Davis and Lane Kiffin both want to get as many games in with their brand new teams as they can. For Florida Atlantic, it's a much different situation. They're going to get mauled by Wisconsin, where Florida International, although Alcorn State has been bet heavily, so I think because it was priced wrong to begin with, but Florida International has a much easier task of it with their FCS foe. But I think both coaches want to get their players as much game time as possible. We saw Lane Kiffin last week, Rob, sit out massive rain delays when that game was certainly in the books and out of the realm of possibility of winning for his FAU Owls, but didn't want to show the team that he was going to quit on any game, and they continued and waited. I think that game ended like 10:01 Eastern time last Friday night. So these two coaches want to get some game time in for their players. Real quick, I want to go back. One more thing that could affect South Florida, should there be 2 group of 5 teams that finish undefeated. We know that the group of 5 always vying for that one New Year's Day bowl slot. Should there be 2 teams that finish undefeated and USF be one of them and come up 1 win shy, I wonder how that would affect the outcome there. If South Florida winds up 11-0, and let's say there's another group of 5 team, and maybe San Diego State that winds up 12-0, and they get the New Year's Day bowl bid because of that. Maybe at that point, South Florida tries to regroup, much like LSU and Florida did last year, because we know they weren't going to play, and all of a sudden, 10 days later or so, or 2 weeks later, they decided, well, we're going to play it. So I wonder if that would affect South Florida. Not sure that it would, but I think it's a consideration nonetheless.
Absolutely, especially when you're talking about division games, conference games, a lot more urgency to make them up than, say, Florida and Northern Colorado. Unless things go terribly wrong for Florida this year, they're probably still going to get to 6 wins and be able to play in a bowl game. Although their cancellation this weekend leads to the issue of that they had a lot of guys suspended for the Michigan game. They hung tough with Michigan for quite a while, deep into the second half before Michigan was finally able to pull away. But they did it on the back of 2 pick-six for touchdowns. They didn't really look in sync offensively. I'm sure they would have liked the opportunity to kind of get some of their guys back on the field and in rhythm before they're faced with the challenge of Tennessee in just a little over a week.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Rob. Last week, against a very young Michigan defense, not void of talent by any means, and in some instances not void of experience. A lot of those guys were involved in games last year, just not starters in games last year. But for Florida, the offense came up short. So much conversation about that offense all off season long, and then you're right up to game day with a choice of 3 quarterbacks: Malik Zaire, Felipe Franks, Luke Del Rio, who's going to start. Franks didn't look very good. It's a tough test against Michigan, but I'm sure Florida would have liked to work out some kinks this week against Northern Colorado. And for Northern Colorado, it's just a tough break because I'm sure they're counting on the financial end of that game to help them out. And I don't think that. I would think that they don't get their check cut because they're not going to play the game. So for Northern Colorado, it was go play Florida, get beat by 5 touchdowns, and take a nice-sized check home. That probably doesn't happen here now for them, so tough break for them as well. But Florida, they're much like Florida State. Florida State's obviously an injury situation. Florida's a disarray type of situation. They need to use this off week to get going here for the Gators. That offense, and I know Callaway didn't play, and he's a big deal in that offense, but, against the defense that can bring it, they just didn't look very good at all.
So anything else? I think there's some injuries that we need to discuss. I know Georgia had a quarterback injury, and that's going to hurt them for their upcoming game against Notre Dame, but we can talk about that when we get to that game in a little while. Any other things that stood out for you in week 1? My question to you, do you agree with Georgia Tech's call to go for 2 on Monday night and try and win the game in the second overtime, or if you had kept it going and get to a third? Anything else you want to talk about here before we move on to some games this coming weekend?
Yeah, real quick, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least reiterate what's been talked about for the better part of 4 days now, and that's the start that Matt Rule, we're both close to the Philly area. We know Matt Rule from Temple, the start that Baylor got off to, getting beat by Liberty, and not only getting beat, but getting lit up defensively. And, of course, the fact that UNLV gets beat by Howard as a 45-point favorite. I think what everybody knows about Howard now is that Cam Newton's little brother is the quarterback, but for UNLV, head coach Tony Sanchez was in no mood to talk to anybody after that loss, and that's tough. We'll see if those two teams can regroup. It's been a big source of conversation this week. But for Baylor, I think, Rob, the more embarrassing loss of the two, we know they've been through a lot of off-field difficulties. We know they've been through, a slew of coaches in the last couple of years with using an interim last year and now getting a whole new coaching staff this year, and there's a mass exodus of high school recruits that were signed to Baylor that bailed out of their commitment over the course of the last couple of years. But still, Liberty's been ranked number 20 in FCS play, but you're not supposed to get lit up like that, 48-45. So those two games certainly stood out from a FCS matchup standpoint. And the other one, maybe I'm in the minority, Rob. I don't know where you stand, but if I was Georgia Tech, I would have kicked the extra point and kept going. I know the case was made on air that night that Georgia Tech, Paul Johnson, the head coach of Georgia Tech, probably knew that he couldn't stop Tennessee at any given point as long as that game was going to continue to be played. But I would make the case that Butch Jones on the other sideline knew that his defense wasn't going to stop Georgia Tech at any point during the night as long as that game was played. So I think after the third overtime, you're forced to go for the 2. Probably would have gone to that situation, tied it up, forced it into that third overtime, and see which one of the two teams can make the 2. And if not, keep going. But for Georgia Tech to, just abruptly hit the brakes and try it right there when Paul Johnson did, I don't know that that's the way I would have coached. I'm not going to fault him for coaching it that way. I'm just saying I think that I probably would have tried to play one more overtime feeling like, I could probably outscore the other guy.
I kind of thought the same way. I thought that, nobody's stopping anybody. Don't take away the opportunity to make that stop later, because chances are they're not going to stop you. So you might as well keep going and try and get a few more points. Here's a question for you. What's more embarrassing, losing to the likes of Howard and Liberty, or blowing a 44-10 lead with 4 minutes left in the third quarter?
Yeah, boy, oh boy, now that was something as well. Wow. They lost to a real opponent, but you can't blow 5 touchdown leads in the middle of the third quarter. So I would say that for Texas A&M, it certainly is humiliating to lose that game in the fashion that they did. For Kevin Sumlin, a guy who's been on the wrong end of hot seat talk for 2 years now, it just wasn't a good loss. But I still think if you're losing to Howard and you're losing to Liberty, it's probably worse. It's not. If you lose, I don't want to. I'm not trying to sell FCS programs short, Rob, because we've seen some of the upper tier, like the top 5, come in and beat people. North Dakota State would go play Big Ten teams over the course of the last, 10 years and win games on the road. North Dakota State, a top FCS program. James Madison, we saw them ranked number 1 in the FCS polls this week, go to East Carolina and blow them out. So they're capable. But I don't think the 20th ranked team going into Baylor, you're Matt Rule, you're off to a new start. There's a lot of work to do there, and I can buy that. So maybe Matt Rule. Let's do this. Let's give Matt Rule the benefit of the doubt. Let's not give UNLV the benefit of the doubt and say that theirs and Texas A&M the losses are equal.
Texas A&M, how do you move forward from that? I mean, they have an easy game this weekend, should be able to recover, you would think, and get a win. But in terms of this season, isn't everything now just magnified even more, and that seat going for someone getting even hotter? And, will players be able to, get back up from something like that? Or do you think it's kind of like the writings on the wall at this point now for Texas A&M, the same thing over and over again, they cannot close a football game?
Yeah, it's really hard to make that judgment from where we stand because you don't know the character of the kid. We'd have to see a situation where A&M was in a fourth quarter struggle. Do they hold off the other team or do they let the other team win a game and come from behind fashion again? That's kind of what you're talking about here. Will they be able to hold up and get some of these games to the finish line? I don't know that we know that because I just don't know the character of the group. It didn't seem like they gave up against UCLA. It just seemed like they got caught in a whirlwind. You have to, some of it had to do with the quarterback as well. When Nick Starkel went out, Rob, that kind of hampered the offense. We could see that Mond is a one-dimensional quarterback. I mean, on any of those drives throughout the end of the third quarter and into the fourth quarter, if they could have moved the ball whatsoever, a couple of first downs, take some time off the clock, anything, it would have been better for A&M. But their passing game went right in the tank when he came in. I think that's something that we know now as far as he's concerned. So if Nick Starkel is not going to be the starting quarterback for that team due to injury in the future, I'd worry about Mond as the quarterback of that team because, boy, oh boy, some of those passes were ugly and they weren't close. And to me, he looked like, a running quarterback that couldn't read progressions or anything. That was problematic.
Let's talk about that for a second. Here you go. You have a kid who really doesn't have experience passing the ball very well, and you're up so big. He threw the ball 17 times in the game. Now, is that something that someone is doing because you're up 44-10 and you just want to let this kid try and get his feet wet and get the feel for some throws? And, to have a 3-and-out here or 3-and-out there, it's probably not going to matter at the end of the game. But they had no business throwing the ball as much as they did in the second half unless you're someone and you're thinking, wow, this lead is so big, let's get this kid some practice throwing the football.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rob. I think some of it we can attribute to down and distance situations where there just have to be passing downs. They couldn't make anything on a lot of those drives, possessions on first down, which forced them into a hole. Some of it, we blame on the style of offense, right? These teams that don't know how to slow the game down when they're ahead so big. But I totally agree with you. Whoever's calling plays on the sidelines knows the talent of the quarterback, and you have to try any way possible to get that clock to triple zeros in the fourth quarter with you still ahead in the football game. And UCLA got, it's a UCLA team that couldn't stop Texas A&M from doing anything. And all of a sudden, they could stop them because they would make a first down stop, and then the kid couldn't throw in second and long, third and long. It helped UCLA incomplete, stopping the clock and everything else. It gave them the necessary possessions to pull that out. But I think you're right. Somehow, some way, you have to find something, whether it be simple bubble screens that maybe go for 5 yards or something of that variety. But he was trying to, he was going back to make downfield throws. And in a lot of instances, looked once and then just caved and overthrew somebody, or went to somebody short and underthrew them, or packed it in and ran at one of those three. And it certainly helped Jim Mora Jr. because, you know what, if A&M had held on, the first half of that game, Jim Mora was the guy that's going to get fired. UCLA was going to be running around. I don't know that people in their administration would have been on Facebook saying, let's fire our coach. But certainly Jim Mora Jr. came into that game with as much heat on his seat as did Kevin Sumlin. So for a half, he was the guy. It looked like he had one foot out the door, and at the end of the game, he looks like a halfway decent coach because they come out with a win.
And, I mean, Rosen, I think, is instantly vaulted into the first quarterback off the board. If he leaves conversation, I think he's, depending on what he does when he has some of these opportunities against teams like USC down the road, I think he's in the Heisman conversation at this point. I mean, that was a stunning second-half performance.
It really was. And, of course, the one throw to the end zone with barely even a toe on the ground against the grain to make that throw. I know that the receiver made a great play on the ball for the touchdown, but still, heck of an arm to be able to throw it that distance and get it completed. So, hey, Josh Rosen did great for himself there. Down the road, like you say, he's going to face some tests. He's going to face a Stanford defense at Stanford. We'll see what his numbers look like at the end of that game. Colorado showed very well defensively against Colorado State, a team that couldn't be stopped in week 1 or week 0, whatever we want to call it. But CU certainly put the clamps on them. There was some thought that without Jim Leavitt as their defensive coordinator, their defense might suffer. Didn't happen in game 1. Certainly at Washington for UCLA on the schedule as well, and at USC. So I would, you'd venture to say that the three best teams in that entire conference, Stanford, Washington, and USC, Josh Rosen has to play them all on the road, doesn't get a single one at home. If he can pull off some numbers in those stadiums, then he'll be right in that Heisman talk. But as we've seen before, it takes one bad week, and all of a sudden you're out of the Heisman. You drop from 1 to 5 in a hurry.
Well, Rob, let's jump right into some games for this weekend here. We'll start with a Big 12 SEC battle as TCU travels to take on Arkansas. Arkansas opened with a 49-7 win over Florida A&M to bring them to 1-0 on the year. TCU may have a little bit of revenge on their mind, as last year Arkansas went into TCU and beat the Horned Frogs 41-38 in a double overtime game. What do you think about this one, Rob? Does Arkansas have a chance to make it 2 in a row against TCU?
I think they certainly have a chance. Arkansas is a good football team with a good quarterback, right, in Austin Allen. And TCU the same. TCU, a lot of people that are, close to the program during the off season felt like this would be a bounce-back year for Gary Patterson and the TCU Horned Frogs. They haven't played by injuries the past couple of seasons, and we haven't really seen the typical TCU defense. I think some of that also has to do with the fact that they went to the air raid system a couple of years ago, and the defense just never, during Patterson's tenure, his defense has never had to face the fact that they might be back on the field 90 seconds later after their team scored a touchdown. So I think all of that was new. The injuries certainly hurt. They affected the offense. They affected the defense. Everything was affected for TCU. Now they seem to be healthy. Kenny Hill's been a fast starter his entire career. We remember the very first game he played. He looked like a world beater, first college football game. And he got up to a good start this year. So to be sold on Kenny Hill after 1 week, you could question somebody who is. I'm not saying that he won't have a good senior year because perhaps, there's a progression from freshman to senior that Kenny Hill has learned some things and won't make the same errors that he's made. throughout the career. If that's the case, TCU is a very good football team on the offensive side this year. I happen to believe that they are, Rob. I think they're balanced, very well balanced this year. Offensive line is good. Receiving core is good. We know a lot of their receivers, play in the NFL right now. Josh Doxson, the most recent one. I think he's with the Redskins. So Texas Christian looks to be back as far as offense is concerned and much better on defense because they're healthy now. But Arkansas poses a huge threat. You always have the big offensive line. You have the Dan Enos-led attack ever since he came from Central Michigan as head coach to become offensive coordinator down there. The play-action pass has really, really flourished in Fayetteville. The one concern I think you'd have about Arkansas right now is that they went to a 3-4 defense this year. They had always played 4-3 under Brett Bielema. They switched to 3-4 because they thought it fit their personnel better. And this is going to be their first real test with that 3-4 defense here against TCU. And we're going to find out if they're already a cohesive enough unit to take on an offense like this. Game total opened up at, I think it was 59. And we've seen it played downward somewhat to 58 or 58.5. I'm not so sure I really agree with that move. It opened 59.5 to be precise here, and now it's sitting at 58, 58.5. These two teams have played barn burners the last couple of years, and with all the talent on the offensive side of the field, I wonder if this won't be a third barn burner in a row. I happen to think it will be. And we'll learn a lot about Arkansas's defense here, Rob. I think that's the biggest thing, the new alignment, the overhaul, the switch of positions that they went through in the spring and fall. We know that when you go from 4-3 to 3-4, you start changing guys' positions a little bit. Defensive ends become outside linebackers. It doesn't always work. Guys need to learn coverage as well as just, rushing the passer or stopping the run. So good test for Arkansas here. I think all around a good game. The bettors love TCU, though. Arkansas opened a 2.5-point favorite, and now TCU is the 3-point favorite. That's a 5.5-point move. That's a big move in a game that would seemingly be so competitive. The price tag tells you it's a competitive game. To see one team move the needle 5.5 points is a lot.
It is. It was a bit of a big move, and I don't necessarily agree with it. I think after what I saw from Arkansas last year against TCU, I might go ahead and give them a shot, get in the 3 at home, and see if they can't at least keep within a field goal, if not pull another upset. A lot of great games to get to. Before we do, I just want to remind everybody, RobVenoSports.com is the place to go for all your handicapping needs this football season. We've got Rob Veno's power rankings. We've got injury news. We've got weather news. We've been doing a great job keeping you up to date on all the cancellations and rescheduled game times for the games impacted by Hurricane Irma this weekend. And, of course, you can buy the selections of myself, Rob Veno, and our other partner, Derek Davis. All that at RobVenoSports.com. Be sure to get there and take advantage of our selections and our prices and, of course, all the information. If you're looking for a little something to try and confirm a play that you might be thinking about, you can go and see if the numbers and the rankings support that or maybe make you think twice before pulling the trigger. RobVenoSports.com, there to help you. Let's keep it rolling along here today, Rob. We got a big game between Clemson and Auburn in Clemson this year. Last year, Auburn gave Clemson a real fight at home, came up just a little bit short. This year, they go on the road to Clemson. Clemson, obviously, without Deshaun Watson this year, still look pretty good against Kent State. I mean, it's hard to really judge when you're playing that level of competition, but overall, they looked pretty good. This will be a real test for both programs, and I think the winner of this game is well on their way towards seriously competing for a playoff spot, and the loser probably going to have to run the table to get that playoff spot. So it's almost like a playoff game here in week 2. How do you see this one shaking out, Rob?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot's made, obviously, during the offseason, and rightfully so, about Jarrett Stidham, the transfer from Baylor to come play quarterback for Auburn. And now that Auburn has a quarterback that can get the ball vertically down the field, the Auburn offense should get on track this season. Obviously, last year they were bogged down the entire year, so much so that they wound up, changing the play calling duties. And offensive coordinator Rhett Lashley became the play caller for the last 6 or 7 games. So this year, supposedly, a different deal from the offense. It's hard to judge, like you said, off of that first game, especially where Auburn's concerned, because against Georgia Southern, they didn't particularly throw the ball well, 15 of 26 for $184, but they ran the ball extremely well, which is the strength of this Auburn team. You wonder if they played it a little bit vanilla so as not to show Clemson very much, whatever they might have incorporated into the offense this year with Stidham at quarterback. I'd venture to say that's the case. So if you just hand it off like Auburn did 53 times in game 1 and you can still win the way that they did, that probably keeps Clemson a little bit off guard as far as their defense is concerned. But their defense played sensational, and I'd almost venture to say right now, Rob, that the defense is the calling card early on this season for the Clemson Tigers, which would make it the calling card for both teams. And when we look back to last year, what did we wind up, 19-16 or something in that game? It was a very hard-fought defensive battle, certainly an under, in a game where Auburn surprised a lot of folks. Their front seven, as good as it gets, Clemson quarterback Kelly Bryant, going to face a much fiercer test here than he did against Kent State. So I think there's so many unknowns in this contest about each of these teams that it makes it really hard to play. It really does. Clemson, like I say, from a defensive standpoint, they really looked outstanding in week 1, and reports all off season were that they were going to be better than last year. Let's see it on the field. Let's see both of these teams against one another. See if the result comes up any different than last year. Myself, I haven't found a way to play this game yet, either side or total, and I doubt that I will. I think this one's going to be more informative for me. Sit back and watch and try and take what we learn from this game and apply it in the future for Clemson-Auburn games where maybe we can catch a couple of tickets. But right now, like I've said, we know the defenses are good, but there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks for me about both teams that will be answered Saturday night.
Speaking of Saturday night, it's a busy slate of really good games. You've got Georgia going to South Bend to play Notre Dame in prime time. Game opened, Notre Dame closer to a touchdown favorite, and that's down now to under a touchdown at 4.5, 5 points now. What do you see in this game here? I mean, Georgia's got a quarterback issue. Notre Dame looked really good offensively on Saturday against Temple, who's a marginal team, not phenomenal, but they looked really good offensively. How do you see this one shaking out?
Yeah, I think if we start with the quarterback situation, Rob, it may be, in my estimation at least, it may be a little bit of addition by subtraction. Jacob Eason, the starting quarterback for Georgia, obviously a good quarterback, but when you watch last week and you watch the kid Jake Fromm come in, he looked like he was the better quarterback at that point. And I don't know that Georgia loses anything. The only thing you would keep in the back of your mind, if talent levels are the same or if Fromm is even the better quarterback, which I think physically the set of tools I saw, he looks like a better quarterback. The one thing you might worry about is going on the road at night to South Bend, first start of your college football career. But reports out of Georgia and the players, in fact, on the offensive side say that nothing rattles Fromm. So I think they're going to be just fine. And when you have Nick Chubb and Sony Michel to lean on, then you can really be fine. So I don't know that the quarterback situation is a big deal. I don't know that it should affect the point spread in any way, shape, or form here. What I think is that, Notre Dame, which ran the ball for 422 yards in that opening contest will be tested severely by this Georgia defense. Temple's restructured a little bit under Jeff Collins. Things are somewhat different. I think the defense came out and got just steamrolled in week one. Obviously, Brian Kelly, the head coach for Notre Dame, went out, got a new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator. Chip Long's offense looked real good, but will it look the same against an SEC defense? Will Wimbush at quarterback be able to make enough plays through the air against Georgia? Again, we see these teams that have expectations and things that we've read and been told to expect out of teams, but now comes the truth time. And, it's kind of hard to gauge where the truth lies in these two contests. For myself, I think that Georgia, because of their ability to run with Chubb and Michelle and throw the football, I'm not totally sold that Notre Dame can throw the football well. St. Brown's a great receiver. Quarterback still got to get it there. Need Wimbush to prove it to me a little bit. I guess you could argue back Fromm hasn't proven anything yet either. So it's another good case where we can learn not even interconference because Notre Dame's an independent, but a non-conference battle here where I just can't, it's tough to figure which way to play. I know that the bettors, the early money poured in on over in this game. It went from 51 all the way to 57, dropped back a little now to 56.5. Notre Dame has increased their tempo this year offensively under Chip Long, so you can probably look for Notre Dame to try and do what teams try to do to Alabama. That formula to beat these big, deep SEC defensive fronts is try to run 85, 90, 95 plays and tire them out so that the depth doesn't help them as much as it would in a slower-paced game. Notre Dame will have their foot on the gas pedal here, and we'll see if Georgia can hold up. They'll have to force a few 3-and-outs and keep Notre Dame off the field to keep themselves well-rested. Fourth quarter could be where this one's decided.
Well, Pac-12 doesn't waste any time getting down to business. They've got USC Stanford this weekend in an early great test for both teams. Stanford coming off of a bye. They went to Australia and played Rice and put up 62 on them. USC kind of let Western Michigan hang around for a bit in that game before pulling away late. They put up 49 points in their victory over them, setting up a huge matchup in Southern California this weekend. What do you see here? Stanford has had some luck against USC recently. Can they go in and pull another upset?
Well, with Stanford, the answer is always yes. Obviously, they can pull upsets predicated solely on defense, and that defense is a brick wall once again. We're not using the Rice result to make that assessment, obviously, even though Stanford absolutely, at the line of scrimmage, the point of attack, destroyed Rice on both sides of the football, ran it down their throats. I think in the first half they had 42 points. And on the other side of the ball, they were after Rice all day long. Sam Darnold and company, about 15 levels above the Rice offense, but they're still going to be in for a tough game here against the Stanford D. I think what separates these two at this point in time, Rob, could be that I think Stanford's offense is a little bit underrated. Now, last year I jumped on Keller Chris. I didn't particularly think either of the quarterbacks were very good for Stanford last year. Both out there really for the first time as starters, Ryan Burns and Chris. But as the season developed towards the end, Stanford's offense became a little more high-powered. Chris gets hurt in the bowl game, made a quick recovery to play in week one against Rice. And from what I saw, and I think, something hit me as they left the field for halftime in that Stanford-Rice game. David Shaw was being interviewed as he left the sideline. And David Shaw made a comment, and I won't get the wording exact to quote him perfectly, but the thought was that they're going to go into the locker room at halftime with this 42-point lead or 35-point lead, whatever it was, and they're going to pretend it's 0-0, and they're going to come back out and try and score some more. That's so unlike Stanford. It's so unlike David Shaw to be somebody who's pushing the pedal offensively with big leads. Stanford's historically a team, especially during Shaw's tenure, that gets a lead and turns to the defense and holds the lead. You don't come from behind and beat Stanford. But this season a little different. I think he's quietly confident with Bryce Love in the backfield, with his quarterback situation, with his receiving situation. The offensive line is good to where now I don't think this guy minds attacking with a lead rather than just first down handoff, second down handoff, third down handoff, punt with the defense, hold on to the lead. They're going to continue to come at you. I think that's different for Stanford this year. USC's in for a huge test. I want to say one thing real quick about Western Michigan, the opponent for USC in week one. As you described, they let Western Michigan hang around, or perhaps it was Western Michigan that hung around. Their offensive coordinator, who used to be in the Big Ten, made a comment after that game, or prior to that game, and said that as he became part of this Western Michigan coaching staff, he started noticing the players' abilities and said that they have Big Ten players on that team, that there's a mass amount of people or personnel on the Western Michigan roster right now that could start inside the Big Ten, and that P.J. Fleck did an incredible job of recruiting at Western Michigan. We know that they were always atop the MAC recruiting numbers under Fleck. But I think maybe we have to credit Western Michigan, even though they lost some talent, even though they lost their head coach and their coaching staff, they're still good enough to go out to USC, put up some big numbers, and give that team a game. So Western Michigan may be somebody to look for this year, even though the returning starting numbers might tell you it's a down year. Probably not for Western Michigan, and maybe USC's effort wasn't as bad as it looks, because, there's a chance Western Michigan's better than a lot of people thought going into that game.
Well, Rob, we would think a matchup between 14 and 6 would probably be the best matchup of the weekend. In this case, it is not. Number 5, Oklahoma, travels to number 2, Ohio State. Last year, Ohio State goes on the road to Oklahoma and gets a big upset victory. This year, can Oklahoma return the favor, or did Ohio State kind of get off whatever rust they had in that first half against Indiana and get it together in the second half, and they looked good and they looked ready to move?
Yeah, there's so many arguments that could be made here in this contest, Rob, but I think in the end, they'd probably point to Ohio State, and that's probably why this game has been bet up from 5.5 to 7 right now. For Oklahoma, last year you had Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine. Last year you had the home field. Last year you had Ohio State marching in week 3 coming in here, or week 2, whatever it was, with just a huge number of freshmen. And Ohio State, the nation not really knowing if Ohio State was any good, and most of the nation believing that Baker Mayfield and his loaded offense, like I say, with a great running back tandem and with some great wide receivers, D.D. Westbrook certainly, and they get mauled. Now this year you go to Ohio State. Ohio State's secondary, once again, is brand new because so many people left last year and wind up as first-round draft picks in the NFL. And that secondary got toasted by Richard Lago for about 3 quarters in that Indiana game. I think Lago threw for 400+. So there's question marks with that secondary. But that might be the only set of question marks here, because when push comes to shove, it looks to me as if Ohio State can really, really run the football this year. It looks to me as if that defensive front 7 is as talented as any. I think there's a huge gap between Oklahoma and Ohio State as far as defensive front 7 is concerned. It depends on J.T. Barrett here, and what he can do through the air against Oklahoma. But I think in the second half last week, when Ohio State played Indiana, in fact on Thursday night, we saw that their numbers their depth, their speed, their physicality all showed up in the second half. It just ground Indiana down to the point where guys are taking swing passes 75 yards. Indiana can't catch them. You could almost see the same thing happening to Oklahoma here in this game unless Oklahoma gets out in front by a big number. And it would have to be done, in my estimation, through the year. Baker Mayfield and that receiving corps would have to have a big day against that secondary. And they, Richard Lago did it. Certainly Oklahoma could do it. But this one's on the road in the shoe. Tough place for OU to play. I know they've been in some tough venues and come out winners, but this one to me is a tough game for Oklahoma. Either side could win, Rob, but I do think at this point in time Ohio State's the better team. I think Urban Meyer, the recruiting level that they're at right now, when you watch these freshmen, is unbelievable. So I'd probably lean towards Ohio State. I'm not a fan of laying 7 in this game, but the total seems to have been a favor of the bettors as well, as they've played it up a little bit. I think I saw 64.5 about an hour ago. So a high total here, people looking for a high-scoring game. Wouldn't surprise me, but I think in the end Ohio State will be your winner in that game.
I think that the only chance Oklahoma has to get the win is, and you hit the nail on the head, Baker Mayfield's going to have to put this team on his back and make some plays, get his receivers to make some plays, and they're going to have to score some points. They're not going to be able to win this game 21-17. It's just not going to happen. If they're going to win this football game, it's going to be 42-38 or somewhere in that realm, and their offense is going to have to make a lot of plays because I think that the Ohio State offense is on track, and they're going to score their points. Can Oklahoma keep up is the question.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Rob, absolutely. And, 42-38 would make a great case for playing over here. I think the Ohio State balance, from what I saw last week, and I know they didn't come out guns a-blazing in the first half offensively, but you've got to remember that, Tom Allen was the defensive coordinator last year underneath Kevin Wilson, so he knows Kevin Wilson's offensive playbook. Kevin Wilson now the offensive coordinator at Ohio State, and the knowledge that the two had of each other, I think it really played into the hands of Tom Allen in the first half. But then Kevin Wilson has way more weapons that he can continue to fire out there against Tom Allen and the Indiana Hoosiers, and it just wore them down. It took its course. Oklahoma doesn't have that type of knowledge. Kevin Wilson would love to pay back Oklahoma. By the way, that's a coaching stop where he was under Bob Stoops for quite a few years. So it'll be a big game for him as OC for Ohio State playing the Sooners here. To me, Ohio State's the better balanced team. The secondary, when we go ahead and try and nitpick Ohio State, I think the only weakness we can come up with right now is that young secondary. They're all highly touted kids. They're going to have to come along and progress. I think last year's group got it much quicker than this group. Although I will say this, last year Ohio State started off, if I'm remembering the schedule right, they started off with like Tulsa and somebody else, some really, really cream-puff defensive teams where Ohio State could just, score enough points to cover up the defense until they learned. We'll see how quickly this secondary comes along, but to make a long story short, that's the only weakness I see in that team right now. Can Oklahoma exploit it enough to get a victory here? I'm not so sure.
Well, Rob, there are just so many games for our under-the-radar picks this week. I'll let you have the first pick here. Give me one game that you think people might not be talking a whole lot about, but that everybody should keep an eye on.
Well, I'll tell you, from the team's perspective, I'll give you the South Carolina-Missouri game, only because in the SEC East, we find every year that that's a winnable division. Georgia's going to have a chance to make a statement. Certainly they're the team that was picked by most everybody to go ahead and win that division. But the winner of this game is going to end up 2-0. and probably on their way to a bowl bid, and it's an East Division game. It's a big one. With so many of those teams, Rob, I think you and I talked about this in a preview. I'm not remembering if we did or not, but when you take South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, those three teams especially have drawn a lot of attention from people this year. South Carolina and Kentucky most notably as teams that are going to make a big jump and be closer to Georgia, Florida this year than they've been in the past. This game will allow one of these teams to have a leg up. When you start separating that division out and you think of these, let's call them toss-up games where it's a little more than a round robin because there's more than three teams involved. But, the South Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee matchups are all going to be really, really important. In this particular game, we saw Missouri last week show little to zero defense, especially in the first half. Head coach Barry Odom was interviewed at halftime and said he came out way too generic, tried to be vanilla, didn't want to show anything on film, said he had to go to the locker room and make adjustments because Missouri State was just going up and down the field on them. The second half numbers were better. Drew Lock's numbers in that offense are going to be off the charts all season long. South Carolina got torched last week by NC State. Ryan Finley was, I think, 45 for 64 with over 400 yards passing, and really it's North Carolina State's fault that South Carolina even won that game. So I don't know that Will Muschamp's team proved an awful lot last week as far as improvement goes. Jake Bentley gaining a lot of press this week, but Deebo Samuel's probably the guy. He ran a kickoff back. He made a spectacular end zone catch in that contest to help South Carolina win, and when push came to shove, it was 4th and goal from the 6 for NC State to tie the game, and they missed on a pass. I think a kid dropped the pass right in the end zone. So, it's a big game. It's a big game for both sides. I don't know that Missouri can stop South Carolina. From what I saw, I don't know that South Carolina can stop Missouri. It'd be a fun game, but I think a real big game for each of those two teams as far as SEC East play is concerned. So I'll look at that one. Missouri currently sits as a 2.5-point favorite. Total, how about this? Total opened at 60.5. It got as high as I think I saw 74. It's down to 71 now. Some take back where that's concerned, but that shows you what the bettors think. We're going to be up and down the field. South Carolina's popped off in newspapers saying that they think they could run for 1,000,000 yards against Missouri's defense. So we'll see how it goes. That's going to be a real good game. I'll choose that for under the radar.
I'm going to go out west to a rivalry that hasn't been that great of a rivalry recently, but it's a rivalry nonetheless, and that's the Holy War. BYU is going to play Utah. The last time BYU beat Utah, you have to go all the way back to 2009. Since then, Utah has absolutely dominated this series. Utah coming off an uninspiring Week 1 win, 37-16. BYU's played 2 games. They did not look great against Portland State. Their offense did absolutely nothing against that LSU defense last Saturday in a game that got moved from Houston to New Orleans. I don't think they could have played that game anywhere. I don't think it would have mattered. LSU was clearly the better football team on the field. But a big game for BYU if they want to get back into the conversation of maybe being that best team, because their schedule gives them the opportunity to do it this year. If they want to be that best team outside the Power 5 conferences to maybe get that bowl game, they get Utah, they get Wisconsin at home, they go to Mississippi State, they play Boise. So there's some quality teams on this schedule, especially in the front half of it, and BYU's got to find a way to get some wins, and I think it's got to start by beating one of their most fiercest rivals in Utah Saturday night. The game's at BYU, but in Utah, you get what I'm saying. Any chance that they can pull off the upset and maybe beat Utah? They were a small favorite to open. Now they're getting as much as a field goal.
Yeah, well, it's a game where Ty Detmer, the offensive coordinator for BYU, is obviously coaching for his job right now. And when your head coach comes out and basically calls you out, head coach Sataki of BYU, saying, this offensive coordinator of ours has to get something going. They didn't cross midfield last week against LSU. And Ty Detmer, and I go back to last year when they hired him and we saw a couple of games, Ty Detmer, for whatever reason, took everything that BYU does well and overhauled it and brought in, a prehistoric NFL-style offense. He had been a coach on the Green Bay Packers staff. But he turned BYU into what we remember BYU as a predominantly passing team, not necessarily a, vertical 40-yard pass every time team, but certainly short, mid-range. They played all three levels, and they ran the ball off of that. And they haven't been the same offensively since. Last year's numbers were down. The numbers in the passing game were down by 96 yards per game, and it's carried over to this year because they stunk against Portland State in week one. I kind of let that one go, Rob, thinking that maybe BYU was playing it real close to the vest because they knew they had LSU on deck and didn't want to show anything. But then when they showed up at LSU, and LSU doesn't have Arden Key, their best defensive end, arguably their best defensive player, and they maul Brigham Young, and BYU looked like they had no chance to move the football. It's come down to Ty Detmer right now, and like I say, the head coach called him out this week. We'll see if he makes some adjustments to this offense, because if he doesn't, they're not going to win this game either. Kyle Whittingham and Utah, certainly they've installed a new offense. Now they're trying to change things because they've gone a little more up-tempo. They had to work out some kinks in the first game. We'll see how that progresses. But I would say that the storyline inside this game is certainly Ty Detmer. I'd be interested to see what the play calling percentages read at the end of that contest, and we'll keep a close eye on that one. That's a good choice for under the radar, because certainly there's some things going on, some underlying things going on in that contest.
Well, Rob, anything else you want to talk about before we wrap it up for our Week 2 early look? Not so early this week. We apologize. We will look to get back to a Wednesday schedule for all of our listeners next week. But before we go, Rob, got anything else for us?
Yeah, I think we pretty much covered everything we wanted to talk about today. Just want to remind everybody once again that selections, college football selections, up and available right now on my end. We've got the college football game selections up and available at Rob Veno Sports. Go ahead and find your way to the homepage. You can pick up a selection package. We've also got the top 5, or my top 5 first half plays for this week. 5 first half games there. So in all, 6-pack of regular games, full games, and also a 5-pack of first half. So once again, you want to visit the homepage, Rob Veno Sports. Go ahead and sign up. I know that Derek will be glad to help you any way he can with your process and getting a package. Other than that, Rob, another big weekend of football, minus the cancellations. We'll see what goes on here tonight. A couple of interesting games. Purdue under Jeff Brom in a national TV matchup against Ohio U, and, of course, the Oklahoma State Cowboys, which we know our third wheel will be very, very interested in. They take on South Alabama. We'll see Mike Gundy's offense in full form once again tonight.
Well, Rob, that will do it for this week. Again, get to robvenosports.com for all of our selections and, of course, all of the great information that you need to help handicap the games yourself. For Rob Veno, I'm Rob O'Connor. This has been your Week 2 early look. We'll be back next week to talk about what we saw on the field this weekend and look ahead to Week 3 of the college football season. Thanks for listening, everybody.